I'm Anna Brooks, 35, and I went from a quiet military town girl near Camp Lejeune to a Marine major carrying a call sign most people never got to hear. For years, I helped raise my little brother, protected him, supported him, and stayed silent about the parts of my life I wasn't allowed to explain. But when he mocked me in front of other Marines, calling me nothing more than a desk officer, I made one choice that changed everything. Have you ever been underestimated or humiliated by someone you gave your loyalty to? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I tell you what happened, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being dismissed, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about respect, boundaries, and reclaiming your worth. What happened next didn't just silence the room, it changed my brother forever. My brother was 4 years old when our father left, and I was the one who taught him how to tie his shoes. There's a 12-year gap between us, wide enough that by the time Cody started grade school, I was leaving for college. The Marine Corps was never something I announced in our house. It was something that happened the way most things did in our family, quietly and with very little fanfare. What I didn't expect was how long the quiet would last, or how much the things I couldn't say would eventually cost me. My father wasn't sentimental about the Corps, but he stood a little taller whenever he saw a Marine, and I noticed that, even when I was small enough that nobody thought I was paying attention. Dennis Brooks was a staff sergeant when he got out, an E5 who'd done his time and transitioned to contractor work before I had any real memory of him in uniform. What stayed behind wasn't his rank or his stories. He didn't tell many stories. What stayed was posture. The way he sat at the dinner table like the chair was a post. The way he went quiet when the news showed footage overseas. The controlled focus of a man watching something he understood in ways he wasn't going to explain. There was a framed dress blue portrait in the hallway of our house near Camp Lejeune, and I used to stand in front of it on the way to the bathroom, looking at a younger version of my father standing very straight, trying to understand what the image was communicating. I couldn't name it yet, but I filed it away. He didn't teach any of it to me directly. He just carried it, and proximity did the rest. By the time I was 10, I understood, without being able to name it, that some kinds of work don't come with explanations. You do it because it needs doing, and the people who can't see it either trust you or they don't. I filed that away too. I would not understand why until much later, when I was the one doing the work that didn't come with explanations, and watching someone I loved try to fill in the gap with whatever story fit. The house on the base-adjacent street in Jacksonville, North Carolina, was a military neighborhood house in every sense. Modest, practical, nothing wasted. Sandra, my mother, kept it clean and kept us fed and worked whatever the base service jobs offered. She was efficient and warm and fundamentally without self-pity, which is its own kind of strength. My parents were not unhappy in those early years, not exactly, but they were not particularly well-matched either, and I understood that the way children understand things, by feel, before the vocabulary exists. What I knew was that my father was a presence defined partly by its own absence, deployed in spirit even when he was home, receding behind something I could feel the outline of but couldn't quite touch. I was not resentful of this. I want to be precise about that. What I learned from watching Dennis Brooks was not bitterness. It was patience. It was the ability to sit in the presence of something large without needing it explained immediately. That skill would serve me for 35 years. Through 3 classified deployments and a decade of family dinners, where I ate quietly and said very little, and watched my brother grow up with a version of me that wasn't quite true. In February of 2003, Cody was born. I was 12, and I held him the day he came home from the hospital, this small, serious-looking thing wrapped in a hospital blanket, already appearing to have strong opinions about the situation he'd been placed in. My mother cried the relieved, exhausted cry of a woman who had just done something enormous. My father stood in the doorway of the hospital room, looking at his son with that same controlled focus. He gave the news coverage, that same particular stillness that meant, this matters, and I am accounting for it. I looked at Cody and felt responsible for him before I had any logical basis for the feeling. He was 4 pounds and change, and somehow already looked like trouble I was responsible for. I thought, somebody's going to have to keep an eye on this one. The 12-year gap that might have made us strangers assigned me a role instead. More than sibling, less than parent, something in the space between those two things that doesn't have a clean name. I didn't understand the weight of it immediately. I just knew that when I looked at him, Something in me calibrated toward him the way a compass calibrates toward north. Whatever direction I was going, I was also going to be keeping track of where he was. The years between his birth and my leaving for college were ordinary years, and I mean that in the best sense. Cody grew into a loud, fast-moving child with a laugh that carried across rooms and a habit of explaining things at length to people who hadn't asked for the explanation. He talked constantly. He had theories about everything. He had a red pair of sneakers he was devoted to with a loyalty I found, even then, admirable in its commitment. In 2007, when I was 16 and Cody was 4, Dennis and Sandra's marriage ended. My father didn't leave dramatically. He left the way soldiers leave, systematically, with boxes, on a Tuesday. He was civil about it. There was no shouting, no extended scene. He loaded what was his into his truck, said goodbye to each of us in turn, with the formal deliberateness of someone who had decided in advance exactly how this moment would go, and drove away. Cody was 4 and did not fully process it. He watched my father's truck until it turned the corner, and then he went back inside and asked me where his red sneakers were. He didn't cry when Dad left. He was too little. He just kept asking me where his red sneakers were. So I sat on the kitchen floor and showed him how to make the loops, and I decided that was the job now. We sat on the kitchen floor for 20 minutes, me holding one sneaker and him holding the other, working through the loop and tuck until it held. He got it on the 6th try. He looked up with his whole face, the way 4-year-olds look at you when they have accomplished something, complete and uncomplicated pride. I decided, sitting on that kitchen floor while my father's taillights were somewhere out of sight, that reliability was going to be the practice. Not loudly, not in a way that required acknowledgement from anyone, but as something constant underneath everything else. The way my father carried the core without explaining it. Something that was simply there. In September of 2009, I enrolled at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill on an NROTC scholarship. I was 18, Cody was 6 and starting 1st grade, and he cried at the airport with his whole body, the way a 6-year-old cries when someone he depends on is leaving and he can't yet process that leaving isn't the same as gone. I did not cry, but I thought about him the whole drive from the airport to Chapel Hill. I called home that night. Sandra put Cody on the phone, and he told me about a kid in his class named Marcus who had a dog, and I listened to the full story, and by the end of it, he was fine. He was always going to be fine. I just had to keep showing up. The 4 years at Chapel Hill were 4 years of becoming something on purpose. NROTC at Carolina was rigorous in the way that good programs are. Not hazing, not theater, but genuine expectation applied consistently. You met the standard or you didn't, and the standard did not negotiate. I met it. I did not find this difficult in the way some people find difficulty. I had been calibrating myself against invisible standards since I was 16 years old on a kitchen floor in Jacksonville, deciding that reliability was the work. Cody came home from school during those years and grew in the rapid, unpredictable way of children between 6 and 10. Grade to grade, shoe size to shoe size, joke to joke. When I came home for breaks, he was always waiting, literally, on the front steps sometimes, which Sandra found touching and slightly embarrassing in equal measure. We had a shorthand by then, the kind that builds between people when the gap is wide enough that every conversation is intentional. He made me laugh. I helped him with reading. He told me about soccer and his elaborate theories about fairness and his strong opinions on the rules of various things. In May of 2013, I was commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps, an O1, the entry point of the officer ranks. The ceremony was held at Chapel Hill. Sandra cried. My father attended and shook my hand with the formal seriousness of a man who understood exactly what the moment signified and was not going to undercut it with sentiment. Cody was 10 years old. He pinned one of my 2nd lieutenant bars. He took this task with complete seriousness, holding his breath, brow furrowed, concentrating with his whole face, the same expression he'd had at 6 years old, working through a shoelace knot until it held. Is it supposed to go there? I don't want to stab you. I told him he wouldn't stab me, just push it through. He did. He stepped back, looked at what he'd made, and nodded once, with the satisfaction of someone who has built something and confirmed it will hold. A local paper asked Cody after the ceremony what his sister did. He said, "She's a Marine officer." He said it exactly right. I have thought about that moment many times since, across 13 years and 3 classified deployments and more silence than I would have chosen. He said it right the first time. He knew what I was, once, before the story got between us and stayed there. The gap between what I did and what I was allowed to say grew wider every year I spent in the Corps. For most of my career, that didn't bother me. Compartmentation is part of the job, not a grievance to be managed or a wrong to be corrected. But watching my brother grow up with a version of me that didn't exist, watching him turn that version into a punchline he ran for 9 years at the family dinner table, was something I didn't know how to address. And so I didn't. I told myself it didn't matter. That was the first mistake. After commissioning in May of 2013, I reported to the basic school at Quantico, Virginia, TBS, where every new Marine officer goes regardless of what comes next. 6 months of fundamentals, followed by the infantry officer course. I earned my 0302 Infantry Officer MOS and was assigned to 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines at Camp Lejeune, back to Jacksonville. Same base adjacent town I'd grown up in, different uniform and a different purpose. The assignment itself was not unusual. The cover story was born here, although I didn't think of it as a cover story at the time. When Sandra asked what I was doing at Lejeune, I said, administrative work, planning, logistics, nothing classified. It wasn't inaccurate. TBS involves substantial administrative work and planning documentation. But I said it in a tone that didn't invite follow-up, and Sandra, who had spent years married to a man whose work was communicated primarily through what wasn't said, accepted it without pushing. Cody was 10 and had other priorities. He just accepted that his sister was a Marine somewhere doing whatever Marines do, and that was the shape of things. It would calcify over the next decade into something harder than an omission and softer than a deliberate lie. And I let it calcify, and that is the part of this I own, without deflection. In 2015, I deployed with 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines to the Mediterranean and Middle East, a standard, non-classified, operational deployment, the kind that gets mentioned in unit newsletters and discussed at family days. My family knew I was overseas. They did not know where. Sandra told the neighbors, Anna's overseas somewhere. It was not yet a lie. Cody was 12, pushing 13, and asked over a staticky phone call what I actually did over there. I told him logistics, administrative coordination, support functions. He said okay and told me about his soccer team. The first time I said administrative support to describe my job, I was 24 and Cody was 12, and it wasn't even wrong enough to feel like lying. 10 years later, it would feel like something else entirely. I returned in 2016 and spent the subsequent year at Lejeune in the peacetime rhythm of a line unit. Training cycles, evaluation reports, the institutional patience required to do good work inside an organization that moves at the pace of permanence. I had been promoted to first lieutenant in November of 2014, mid-deployment, no ceremony, just a new pay grade and the expectation that I'd keep moving. In May of 2017, I was promoted to Captain 03, 4 years from commissioning, the standard track for a Marine officer without significant delays. That same month, I received a notification that I'd been selected for MARSOC assessment and selection. I did not tell anyone in my family. At Thanksgiving of 2017, I was 26 years old, a newly promoted captain who had spent the previous year in the field and was processing a MARSOC selection I couldn't discuss with anyone in the room. Cody was 14 and helping himself to mashed potatoes when he said, Anna's the Marine who works in an office. I'm going to be the one who actually does stuff. The table laughed. My father, calling briefly from out of state, laughed too. I smiled. No offense, but I'm going to be the one who actually does something. Pass the rolls, Cody. He was 14. He didn't know better, and I couldn't tell him better, and I let myself believe that it didn't matter because the truth would eventually resolve itself. The truth does tend to resolve itself. I just hadn't fully accounted for how long it might take, or for the shape the joke would take on by the time it did. I completed MARSOC assessment and selection in 2018 and began the training pipeline, a process that took most of a year and required the kind of sustained, specific focus that leaves very little bandwidth for anything peripheral. In 2019, I was officially assigned to 2nd Marine Raider Battalion at Camp Lejeune. The work was fully compartmented. I received my call sign, Fury 10. I told Sandra I'd been reassigned to a different section. She said okay. She had learned not to push. In March of 2021, I began my first classified MARSOC deployment. I was 30 years old and a captain doing exactly the work I had spent 8 years training toward. In July of that same year, while I was deployed, Cody enlisted. He sent a photo of himself at the swear-in, determined and slightly terrified, which is the right combination for someone signing a contract with the federal government at 18. He sent a photo of himself in his dress blues after boot camp graduation. He looked like our father in that picture on the wall, the one I grew up looking at. I was 9 time zones away, and I couldn't tell him that. I watched the graduation photos come through a narrow comms window on a low-resolution screen at a forward position. Cody at the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor ceremony. Sandra in the bleachers in a yellow cardigan, hand over her mouth. He exited as a private first class, E2, the bottom of the enlisted ladder, and exactly where every Marine starts. I saved the photos in a folder I checked only offline. He was a Marine now, and I was several time zones away with a call sign he had never heard. I returned from the first classified deployment in January of 2022. Cody had been promoted to Lance Corporal, E3, the previous month. We saw each other at Thanksgiving of 22. He was 19 and sat across the table from me with the energy of someone who had just joined a thing and believed that joining gave him standing to speak about it with authority. I keep waiting for Anna to do something exciting. I think the desk is winning. He said it harder than at 14. He was a Marine now, and he thought that changed the comparison. The cover story took on its own life in the years I spent at MARSOC. Sandra would occasionally tell extended family that I was in operations somewhere, a vague phrase that could mean anything, and probably did. My father, in his rare calls, never asked follow-up questions. He understood, better than anyone, that some work comes without a forwarding address. The family had developed a kind of practiced incuriosity that I both relied on and found in quiet moments, isolating in its efficiency. He didn't know I'd just come back from a classified deployment. He didn't know my call sign or my unit. I was, at the time, a captain in a special operations unit with a year of classified work behind me. I ate my sweet potatoes and said nothing. Across 4 more Thanksgiving tables through 2025, the joke repeated and evolved, and I kept saying nothing, and that choice, made each time every year, belongs to me. In March of 2026, I received rotation orders for the USS Baton. I reviewed the MEU manifests during pre-embarkation coordination and found Cody's name in the battalion landing team roster. I stared at it for a long moment, then I closed the folder. You want me to route comms through the MEU S6 or handle it direct with the ship? Webb was asking about handoff logistics. I told him direct, and I told him this was quiet, no pre-coordination with the BLT beyond what the handoff required. He nodded and picked up a pen. I picked up mine and started the packing list. I came up from below decks to check an engine, a practical task, 30 minutes, nothing more. I was not thinking about Cody. I was thinking about fuel lines. I heard him before I saw him, that particular laugh, the one that hasn't changed since he was 14, and I had maybe 3 seconds before he spotted me. He was already walking toward me with Gunny Calderon, and he had that smirk he gets when he thinks he already knows how something ends. My element boarded the USS Baton on approximately April 14th of 2026. The Baton is an amphibious assault ship. Large, loud, functional in the way of things built to carry Marines into difficult situations and bring them back out again. MARSOC elements operate with a low footprint aboard ship. We used a dedicated below-decks workspace, 8 at off-peak hours, kept our operational lanes clear of the MEU structure, except where the handoff required direct coordination. I established the working rhythm on the first morning, brief at 0600, equipment checks through the morning watch, planning through the afternoon, final prep in the evening windows. It was the rhythm of every deployment I'd run since 2019. It didn't require thought. That kind of competence is the one thing that feels, in certain moments, like rest. I had spotted Cody once in those first 48 hours, across the galley at evening chow, his back to me, talking to someone I didn't recognize from his platoon. I stepped the other direction. I was not hiding from him. I was waiting, with no fixed expectation of what I was waiting for. Some part of me wanted to see who Cody was when he didn't know I was watching. That was the honest reason. The operational reason was also valid. You don't introduce personal complexity into a handoff. Both things were true, and I held both of them without needing to choose. Aboard ship, MARSOC elements don't announce themselves. You eat, you plan, you do your work, and you stay out of the MEU's lanes. Cody was 2 decks above me for 48 hours, and I let the ship be large enough for both of us. On the afternoon of April 16th, approximately 1400 hours, I came up from the workspace to check on the combat rubber raiding craft engine my team had staged on the hangar deck for that night's insertion. The engine had been giving inconsistent readings during the morning checks, and I wanted to personally confirm the fuel line integrity before the brief. I was in utilities, streaked from the morning's work, hands greased, hair pinned back under a cover. I was not presenting myself to anyone. I was checking a fuel line. The hangar deck of an amphibious assault ship is a large, echoing industrial space. Aircraft parked in rows, equipment pallets stacked against the bulkheads, the constant hydraulic and mechanical noise of a working vessel. I was moving toward the CRRC staging area when I heard his laugh first. That particular laugh, the one that carries across rooms, the one that hasn't changed in substance since he was 14. Then he spotted me from across the deck, and his face did the thing it always does when he sees someone he wasn't expecting. A quick, genuine light up, the kid surfacing through the lance corporal for a second. He was crossing the hangar deck with a small group, 3 or 4 junior enlisted from his platoon, and walking with him was Gunnery Sergeant Ray Calderon. Calderon had been briefed at 0600 that morning on the inbound MARSOC element. He knew the call sign. He had operated under Fury 10's command during a joint operation in April of 2023, a classified engagement in a province I do not name. He was 43 years old and an E7, and a man whose face has the particular economy of expression common to senior NCOs who have worked in hard places for a long time. As he crossed the hangar deck with Cody's group, he already knew exactly who was standing on the other side of it, in greased utilities, checking a CRRC engine. He knew it the moment Cody lit up. Cody said it the way he always says things he thinks are funny, like the punchline is already written, and he just has to deliver it. "Gunny, this is my sister. Ask her what her little call sign is." A few of his buddies snickered. Calderon didn't react to the snickering. He looked at me the way a man looks at something he already knows, making a decision about how to proceed. "Go ahead, ma'am." He was giving me the floor, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he was choosing how this moment would go. I set down the shop rag. I didn't sigh. I didn't build to it or pause for effect. I looked up evenly and set it flat. Fury 10. Calderon's face changed. Not surprise. The recognition was already there. What changed was the transition from knowing to having to respond to the knowing in front of other people. He took one step back. He came to attention so hard his boots rang on the steel deck plate. And then he turned to Cody, and his voice dropped to the particular, surgical quiet of a senior NCO who has decided that not shouting is the more effective weapon. "Devil dog, shut your mouth! Now!" The snickering stopped. Cody's smirk stopped. Calderon addressed me as Major, then as Fury 10, and then, lowering his voice further, not for the room but precisely for one lance corporal in it, he referenced the operation. The province, the year. Not the specifics. The existence of it, and the fact that he'd been there, and what that meant about the size of what had been standing on this ship while Cody was 2 decks above, making assumptions. "Major, it's good to see you, Fury 10. I'll make sure he understands." He said the last sentence quietly, and that quietness was the point. I did not look at Cody again. I had 2 more items on my checklist. I worked through both of them with the same focus I'd brought to the first. I confirmed the engine staging. I wiped my hands with a clean rag. I told Webb, arriving from across the deck, that the engine check was complete and to get the team staged for the 2000 brief. Then I walked to the ladder well and went back below. I had 2 more items on the checklist. I finished them. That was the job. What happened on that deck had already happened. Calderon handled it the way only a man who'd been in the field with me could handle it. There was nothing left for me to add. The thing I remember most clearly about those 48 hours aboard the Baton before the hangar deck is not any specific operational event. It's the quality of normal. I moved through the ship's corridors and ate in the galley and worked in the below-deck space, and none of it felt remarkable, which is how it's supposed to feel when the preparation has been thorough. Routine is the product of preparation. The moment a deployment starts feeling remarkable is the moment something in the preparation has failed. Cody was 2 decks above me, living his own version of routine. I thought about that occasionally, how close the proximity was, how ordinary the distance felt from inside it. We were both doing our jobs, in our respective lanes, on the same ship. That's not poetic. That's just the core being a small world. But I was aware of it, the way you're aware of something you're deliberately not resolving. And I let myself be aware of it without acting on it yet. Cody needed to sit with what Calderon had said without an audience providing him an alternative reaction. I gave him the dignity of not being corrected twice. He stood on the hangar deck, not moving, not speaking, as my boots disappeared down the ladder well. Whatever was happening in his mind at that moment, it needed room to happen without anyone watching it happen. I ran my insertion that night. The operation went as planned, clean, no complications, the team back aboard before 0200. Cody didn't know any of that was happening while he was trying to sleep 2 decks above. When I found him on the weather deck at 0230, he looked like a man who had been sitting with something too large for the chair he was sitting in. I told my team to stand down. Then I went to find my brother. At 1900 hours, I briefed the element in the below deck's workspace. Routes, contingencies, comms plan, extraction timing. The brief ran 38 minutes, which is about right for an operation at that scale. Thorough, without being so long that the team starts losing the early information before the end. Webb sat to my left taking notes on things that didn't strictly need noting, which is what he does when he's managing his own readiness for an operation he can't directly affect. He's a good XO. He stays close without crowding the space. After the team moved to prep their gear, he stepped close and asked quietly if I was okay. "We've got a 2045 launch," I said. "Get your kit squared away." He did. The insertion went off at 2045. I've done enough night insertions that the water doesn't feel cold anymore, or maybe it does, and I've just stopped tracking it as a distinct sensation separate from the work itself. The operational specifics belong in a classified after-action report, and not in this account. What I can say is that the team was prepared, the execution was clean, and we reboarded the baton before 0200 hours. I conducted the debrief, I documented the after-action, I showered and changed into clean utilities. I did not sleep. I went above decks. The operation went clean. My team came back. That's the whole story, and the whole story is enough. The weather deck of a ship at sea in the Mediterranean at 0230 is cold and dark and entirely without pretense, just water and wind and the sound of the hull moving through it. I found Cody at the port rail. He'd been there long enough that his utility cover was dark with mist. When he turned and heard me approach, he straightened, not a formal brace, just the instinctive pull of a Marine whose body knows the appropriate response even when his brain is preoccupied with other things. He didn't smirk. He didn't have anything ready to say, which for Cody is significant. I stood beside him at the rail and we both looked at the water for a moment. Then I started talking. Not a lecture. I'd already decided a lecture was never coming. Not a debrief. Just the truth in the shape I could give him without breaking anything that needed to stay whole. I told him what I could give him, the day the MARSOC selection notification came. What that meant, what the pipeline required, why compartmentation is not an option and not a personal choice made to exclude the people who love you. I told him about the cover story with accuracy, not accusation. I let it happen, and I kept it going longer than operational necessity required. And some of that was the job, and some of it was that the conversation I needed to have didn't have a clear opening for 13 years, and I kept waiting for one and making the choice not to force it. "Why didn't you just tell me?" He asked it quietly, without the performance. "Because I couldn't," I said. "And then it was easier not to. And then it was Thanksgiving and you were doing the bit and I just let it go." He was quiet for a moment. He asked if I was scared, on the operation tonight, on others. I told him that wasn't quite the right frame. He asked what the right frame was. I said, "Prepared. You do enough of the preparation that fear becomes something you've already budgeted for and spent and moved past before you're in the water." He considered this without arguing with it, which was new. I asked him why he kept making the joke. He gave me an answer that wasn't really an answer, something about not thinking it through, about it being something the table expected, and I didn't push. He was being more honest than usual, and I wasn't going to punish honesty by demanding it come out perfectly. We were on a ship in the Mediterranean at 3 a.m, and that was probably enough honesty for one night. I told him some of it was on me. I could have said, at any point in the last 9 years, "This joke is not funny to me." I had the words. I didn't need a classification review. I let it run because it seemed simpler, and I let it run for so long that it became part of the furniture, and that was my failure to address, and I owned it without drama. Cody asked me once, somewhere in those 3 hours, what the hardest part was. Not the operations. He understood by then that I wasn't going to describe operations. The hardest part of the rest of it. I thought about it for a moment. I told him, the Thanksgiving tables. Not because the jokes were so cutting, but because every time I sat there and let it go, I was choosing the cover story over him. I was deciding that operational convenience mattered more than his ability to know me. That's a defensible choice, and I made it, and I would make most of those choices again if the operational circumstances required it. But I'd stopped asking myself whether they all required it. That's the part that cost something. He was quiet after I said that. Quieter than the silences we'd been sitting in all night, which were already different from his usual silences. Then he said, "Mom never pushed either." I said I knew. He said, "She always knew something was there." I said she did. He asked if it bothered me that she never pushed. I told him honestly, no. Her not pushing was its own kind of trust, the same kind my father had modeled without naming it, the belief that the person doing the work knows something about the work that the person waiting can't fully see. And that's okay. That you can love someone through their necessary distance without needing the distance to be smaller. Cody sat with that for a while. The ship moved around us. The Mediterranean was dark and very cold, and entirely indifferent to any of it, which is its own kind of comfort. The world is large, and your particular accounting is small inside it, and that smallness is not a diminishment. It's a relief. Before we went below, he asked one more thing. He asked if I was proud of what I'd done, not looking for a compliment, just asking a real question. I said yes. He nodded. He said, "I think I understand why now." I said that was the whole point of the night. We talked until almost 0300 hours. Cody didn't fill the silences the way he normally does. He asked better questions than I expected, and he sat with the answers rather than immediately generating a response to them. The silence between us at the end was entirely different from the silence on the hangar deck 8 hours before. Something had been set down, not resolved, not finished, but set down. And the space it had been occupying between us felt, for the first time in a very long time, like it could hold something other than a story that wasn't quite right. The morning after the weather deck, I had to decide what I was going to do with what had happened, not the hangar deck, which was done, but the conversation afterward. Cody had listened. That was new. What I chose to say in the days that followed would determine what we were going to be on the other side of this. I was deliberate about it. I had to be. On the morning of April 17th, I passed GCT Calderon in a passageway near the berthing areas during the 0800 routine. He was moving with purpose in the opposite direction, the way a gunnery sergeant always moves, like the next task has already been identified and the only variable is the time it takes to close the distance. We didn't stop. No words were exchanged. He nodded from across the corridor, once controlled, the nod of a man acknowledging something that has been handled correctly on both sides of a shared moment. I nodded back. That nod carried the weight of shared operational history. He had handled the hangar deck correctly, found the precise register, said exactly what needed to be said, and done it without being asked and without editorializing beyond what the moment required. I was acknowledging it. He was acknowledging that his read of the situation had been accurate, and his response had been proportionate. Nothing else was required between two people who have worked in hard places and understand what competent handling looks like when they see it. A nod from a GISQT who's seen what I've seen and said what he said at the right moment is worth more than most conversations. We didn't need anything else. That was our last direct exchange in this story. Cody went back to his squad space, quieter than usual. I knew this not from direct observation, but from the particular absence of his usual presence, the running commentary, the small performance that junior enlisted spaces run on, the reflex of making every room acknowledge him when he enters it. One of his squad mates apparently asked if he was all right. He said he was fine. He was not fine, but not in a damaging way. He was doing something he didn't have much practice with. Sitting with the fact that he had been wrong. Not wrong in a minor or easily corrected way. Wrong in a way that had 13 years of history behind it. And Calderon had carved that history into him with a few precisely chosen sentences on a steel deck. And Cody now had to decide what to do with the weight of it. Calderon didn't need me to correct Cody a second time. I didn't. But I could see, from a distance, that something had shifted in the way Cody moved through a room. He was quieter. That was new. Between April 18th and 20th, I arranged a brief private conversation, a secondary compartment, neutral ground between the operational spaces and the MEU's berthing areas. I told Cody what is unclassified about MARSOC, that it exists, how assessment and selection works for both officers and enlisted, what the training pipeline requires, what it means in practical terms to command a company in that context. Not to impress him, the impressive moment had already happened on the hangar deck. I offered the information because he deserved to understand the structure of the thing, even if he couldn't know the operations themselves. I also told him directly that the desk joke was finished. "I'm not angry at you," I said. "I'm telling you, it's done. You don't have to apologize in some big way, just let it be done." He thought about it for a moment. Then, "What do I tell the guys? They all saw what happened." "You don't say anything," I said. "You just act differently, that's all." He sat with that without filling the silence. A different version of himself, not less, just more contained. Less performance, more presence. I didn't say so. I didn't need to. On April 21st, the operational handoff concluded on schedule, and my element staged on the flight deck for extraction by helicopter. The gear was loaded, Webb had his checklist, the aircraft were prepped. As I boarded, I caught a flash of movement at the far edge of the flight deck, Cody standing at the perimeter. Far enough not to interfere with the operation. Close enough that when I turned before stepping on, I found his eye. We didn't hug, we didn't wave. I gave him a single nod, measured, unambiguous, the same kind Calderon gave me in the passageway the morning before. An acknowledgement that translates across every context the Corps creates. I see you. You're part of this now. Hold the standard. In the days between our conversation and the element's departure, I kept the interactions with Cody brief and purposeful, not cold, calibrated. He was still a lance corporal in a MEU that wasn't my unit, and the appropriate distance between a major and a junior enlisted Marine, who happened to be my brother aboard a ship with two operational structures running parallel, was not zero. I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. He understood that without me saying it, which was itself a sign of something. What I noticed in passing, across those days, was smaller than what people probably expect when they imagine a turning point. He laughed at different things, not bigger laughs, more selective ones. He wasn't laughing to fill space anymore or to mark himself as the funniest person in the compartment. He laughed when something was actually funny, which sounds like a small thing, and isn't. The performance had always been loudest in the moments when he was least sure of himself, and the confidence that came from performing, the kind that depends on the room's reaction, is a fragile thing. What I was watching in those days was a person who might be building something less fragile in its place. Webb asked me, on one of the last days aboard, whether I wanted to arrange a more formal goodbye with Cody before extraction. I told him no. He was a lance corporal, and I was a major, and we were both Marines, and the goodbye would happen the way Marine goodbyes happen, by doing the job and leaving when the job is done. He didn't push it. He understood, which is one of the things that makes him a good XO. I also thought about Calderon in those final days, not with any particular emotion, with the professional accounting that any competent officer applies to the people who effect an operation, even when the effect was personal rather than tactical. He'd acted with precision in a moment that had no playbook. He'd seen the dynamic clearly, weighted what the hangar deck needed against what it would cost, and made a decision in real time that turned out to be correct. That's the whole of good judgment. Seeing clearly, weighing accurately, and acting in time. Most of what the Corps teaches is aimed at producing that capacity in people. Calderon had it. He'd had it in April of 2023 when he worked under my element, and he had it on the hangar deck of the Baton, and I'd seen enough of both to understand that it wasn't circumstantial. The handoff itself concluded cleanly. There's a particular satisfaction in operational work that goes according to plan, not the satisfaction of drama avoided, but the quieter satisfaction of preparation paying off. You plan, you prep, you execute, and the gap between what you anticipated and what actually happens is small. That's not luck, that's the work. I felt that satisfaction when the paperwork closed and the element was staged and the checklist was done. Whatever happened on the hangar deck lived in a different register from the operational work, and the operational work was complete. Both things were true at the same time. I had done the job I came to do, and something else had happened that I hadn't planned, and both of those things were going to travel home with me on the same aircraft. This time, he understood. As the helicopter lifted, Cody's figure shrank on the flight deck below, still standing, still watching me go. I was back at Lejeune within 48 hours of the Baton liftoff. The debrief took a day, the paperwork took 3. The 26th MEU continued its Mediterranean rotation, and Cody stayed with it, still in the machine, still doing his job. I could tell from a brief mention in a phone call with my mother that something had moved in him. I didn't know yet what it would become. The operational rhythm of company command is relentless in the way that good institutional work tends to be. Not dramatic, not televised, just constant. Back at 2nd Marine Raider Battalion, I ran the debrief cycle with Webb, submitted the after-action documentation, began the next cycle planning review. The lieutenant colonel commanding the battalion, 05, senior to me, the kind of officer whose primary communication style is a very small and precise range of eyebrow positions, reviewed the baton after action and signed off without comment, which in that context is the best possible outcome. The quiet of ordinary duty days resumed, and I let them resume without resistance. I've learned that most of the work worth doing happens in the hours nobody films. Back at Lejeune, the paperwork is unglamorous and the coffee is bad, and that's fine. That's the actual job. Aboard the Baton, still in the Mediterranean, Cody returned to the MEU's routine. Calderon did not revisit the hangar deck with him, verbally. He didn't need to. A gunnery sergeant who makes a correction and then follows it up with another verbal correction hasn't made a correction. He's established a pattern of management, which is a different thing and a lesser one. What Calderon did instead was watch. Whether the behavior changed or reverted to baseline, whether the correction held under the ordinary pressure of junior enlisted spaces, where the easiest path is always to perform for the room. What he saw was the drop. Cody stopped performing for the group. He still did his job, he was never a bad Marine, and the Corps doesn't sustain genuinely bad Marines past a certain point in their career. But the habit of positioning himself as more than by quietly diminishing others, the reflex of making the room smaller so he'd look larger in it, had dropped. Calderon noted it with the accuracy of a man who's been right about most things for long enough to trust his own read. Calderon told me later, months after, by chance, that Cody had gotten quiet after the Baton and stayed that way. He said it like a compliment. I took it as one. Cody had called Sandra separately from the ship. He couldn't explain what happened without explaining what I do, which he now understood he couldn't do. So he asked her instead what she actually knew about my job. She said what she always said. Lejeune, administrative work, planning. Cody paused. Then, I think she does more than that. Sandra said she'd always suspected. He said, yeah, they left it there. I think I should have pushed less too, just in a different direction. One evening in late April, I was in my quarters at the end of a long administrative day, making tea the way I make tea at the end of long days, with full attention to a small task, because full attention to small tasks is its own kind of maintenance. My phone buzzed. Unknown number, area code I didn't recognize immediately. 3 words. I didn't know. There is a particular quality to the weeks after a deployment rotation that I've never quite been able to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. Not the dramatic reintegration of a long deployment. This was a short, operational handoff, measured in days rather than months, but still, the first days back have a texture that ordinary duty days don't. The rhythms of a ship are different from the rhythms of a base, and the body makes note of the difference in small ways. The solid stillness of ground, the absence of the low hum that a ship's engines create beneath every other sound, the sky overhead, that isn't bracketed by superstructure. You re-acclimatize. It takes about 3 days. I did not spend those 3 days thinking about Cody. That's not indifference, it's the operational discipline of keeping the right things in the right registers. The Baton was done. The debrief was documented. What had happened with Cody was in a different file, and that file was not going to be opened while I had after actions to submit and a training cycle to restart. The personal accounting can wait when the operational accounting is still open. It always has before. Webb gave the company one down day after the debrief closed. Not ordered, just recognized, the particular leadership judgment of knowing when a team needs a seam between one thing and the next. I appreciated it. I used the day for paperwork I'd been deferring and a long run and approximately 8 hours of sleep in that order. On the second day back, I stopped in my office before the morning brief and looked at the photo I keep on the corner of the desk. Not a military photo, not something framed for display. A snapshot, me and Cody at a family event years ago. Before the jokes started or before they started mattering. He was maybe 12, I was maybe 24, and we were both laughing at something off camera. It's not a remarkable photo. It's the only one I have of us from a period when neither of us was performing anything for anyone. I looked at it for a moment, and then I went to brief the company. The element had questions about the next cycle that needed answering, and I answered them. That is the job. That is always the job. Whatever else happens, the job continues. Sandra's call came during the lunch hour on the third day back. She had that particular Sandra Brooks cadence she uses when she's working up to something, a few sentences of ordinary update, the sound of coffee being poured, a careful pause. She said Cody had called and sounded different. She said it the way someone says a thing they've been noticing for a while and are only now putting into words. I told her we'd had a conversation on the ship. She said, "Just a conversation." I said, "A real one." She said, "Good." And she meant it in a way that told me she'd been waiting for that to happen for longer than I'd known she was waiting. She asked if I was eating. I told her yes. She asked if I was sleeping. I said enough. She said, "Okay." And in the Sandra Brooks dictionary, okay means, I trust you. I worry anyway. And I'm not going to say either thing out loud because you don't need me to. I identified it as Cody from context. New number, he'd switched providers. I read the message twice. I put the phone in my pocket. I finished making the tea. Then I picked the phone back up and saved the number. He wrote 3 words. That was enough. I saved his number and I thought about it for most of the next hour, not what he should have done, but what happens next. The phone sat on the table beside my tea, his number now in my contacts, the message still unanswered, the decision about what came next already made, in the way that some decisions are, not through deliberation, but through the quiet recognition that there was never really a question about what you were going to do. I called him back. Not immediately, not to make him wait, but because I needed to know what I wanted to say before I said it. The first call was short, the second was longer. He asked better questions the second time, and I answered more of them. That's the most accurate summary of where we were headed. Better questions, more answers. I called the day after his text. The ship's comms window was limited, and the connection had the characteristic satellite delay that adds a half-second of lag to every exchange, putting the two sides of the conversation perpetually slightly out of sync. You can't really perform over a satellite delay. The lag catches every pause and turns it into a gap. And gaps have to be filled with actual content. Cody picked up immediately. I said I got his message. He said he meant it. I said I knew. A good silence, the kind that doesn't press to be filled, and then he asked one question I could actually answer. Are you good at it? Yes. Okay. The call ended 12 minutes after it started, but it was the first exchange between us not operating under the old story, and that was worth 12 minutes and more. In early May, aboard the Baton still rotating in the Mediterranean, Cody started asking his squad leader questions. The specific kind, not the performance kind, where you ask questions to demonstrate that you're someone who asks questions, but the kind that come from having a concrete problem and knowing someone who might have relevant information. What does a pro-con record need to look like to be competitive for reconnaissance? What do advanced schools require in terms of physical assessment? When is the right point in a career to start thinking seriously about that track? His squad leader answered carefully and specifically. Make corporal first, get a solid proficiency and conduct record. Distinguish yourself in the rifle platoon where you are. The advanced schools will still be there when you've earned the foundation. Cody listened without interrupting. His squad leader noted it, told me later briefly and accurately, without editorializing, that something had changed in the Lance Corporal. The casual inflation of self that had been his defining characteristic in the squad bay had been replaced by something quieter and more purposeful. He didn't say why. He didn't need to. He didn't call me to announce he was going to be a raider. He didn't make promises. He asked his squad leader what it would take to move forward, and he listened to the answer. That was enough for me. The second call came 10 days after the first, with a better connection and a longer window. Cody called from somewhere aboard the Baton that had slightly less ambient noise than before, which mattered because the earlier satellite delay had made every pause feel like a technical problem. This one didn't. This one was just a pause. He asked about MARSOC and the terms that are publicly available. The enlisted pipeline, selection timing at his career stage, what makes a candidate competitive, the physical standard, and the way the Corps tends to view proven platoon performance as the foundation for anything that comes after. He asked good follow-on questions, the kind that showed he'd thought about the answers before asking for more. Then he asked why I hadn't gone to a different branch, Army maybe, which offered a higher volume of special operations billets and a different pipeline structure. I told him I was a Marine. That's not actually an answer, he said. Yeah, it is, I said. At some point in that same call, he said, I used to think you had the easier Marine Corps. I asked him what changed that. He said Calderon's face. Not what Calderon said, the face before the words, the split second between hearing Fury 10 and coming to attention, the involuntary recognition of something larger than expected. He'd been turning that moment over for weeks, apparently, with the same thoroughness he used to apply to things he could argue about. This was something he couldn't argue with, and the inability to argue had made him actually look at it. I told him that was a good thing to have seen. He said he wished he'd seen it earlier. I said me too, probably, but earlier wasn't when it happened, and we work with the timeline we have. He laughed a little at that. Not the large, room-claiming laugh he usually carries, the one that announces arrival and expects acknowledgement. This was smaller and more real, the kind of laugh that isn't performing for anyone because there's no one in the room it needs to impress. I hung up the phone and sat in the quiet of my quarters for a moment. Not relieved exactly, lighter. The sound of Cody's real laugh still in the room, smaller than usual and more genuine and better for it. Webb noticed in the indirect way Webb notices things. One afternoon in the planning space, he said, without preamble and without looking up from the operational calendar, "You seem different." I asked him different how. He thought about it for a moment. He said, "Less separate from things." I didn't correct him or explain it. I just said, the baton rotation was productive. He said, "Okay." And in the Marcus Webb dictionary, that means, I noticed something. I said something. I don't need it explained. We can move on. He's a good XO. I've said that before. It bears repeating. Sandra sent me a text 2 days after the second call. Not a message about Cody, just a photo. Me at the commissioning, 2023, the one where I just received the Major's oak leaf. She'd found it on her phone, she said. She just wanted to send it. I looked at the photo for a moment, myself in uniform, somewhere forward, whatever the operational context was that I can't name. And I noticed that I looked exactly like the person in the hallway portrait. Not my father, just someone who carries something. I saved the photo. I put the phone in my pocket and went back to work. There's a particular feeling that comes when something heavy for a long time starts to lift, not all at once. Not dramatically, just incrementally, like pressure equalizing after a change in altitude. I didn't realize how much weight I'd been carrying in the gap between what I did and what I was allowed to say until some of that gap started to close. It wasn't resolved. It wasn't clean. But something had shifted, and I could feel it in the ordinary days. Back at 2nd MRB in the first week of May, the work was the same. Planning cycles, training rotations, the administrative weight of running a company in a special operations battalion, the endless documentation that is the underside of every operational undertaking, unglamorous and necessary in equal measure. Webb had his checklist. I had mine. The lieutenant colonel's eyebrow positions communicated, as always, that standards would be maintained and that this expectation was not open to interpretation. All of this was unchanged. What was different was subtler. There is a kind of background noise that lives in the part of your mind responsible for managing unresolved things, not a sound, exactly, but a hum. The low, constant hum of maintaining two versions of yourself simultaneously. The version that exists in the classified world and the version that exists at the family dinner table, and the ongoing cognitive work of keeping those two versions from ever fully touching each other. I had been running that background hum for 13 years. It had been so constant and so continuous that I'd stopped registering it as a separate thing. It had merged with the baseline of ordinary consciousness, the way background noise in a building becomes inaudible until someone turns it off, and the silence that follows is the first indication of how much noise there had been. It was quieter now. Webb noticed, though he didn't name it, he communicates primarily through behavior rather than observation, which suits both of us. What I noticed was that he asked sharper questions in planning sessions and got faster answers, And afterward, he mentioned that the briefs were running tighter than usual. I didn't attribute it to anything in conversation. The job didn't change, my head changed very slightly in a way that's hard to articulate. When you've been holding something at arm's length for 13 years and you're finally allowed to set it down, the room feels different. That's the most accurate description I have. On a Tuesday in early May, I went for a run on the trail off post that I've been using since my first assignment to Lejeune, the one that goes past the tree line and curves along the drainage field before looping back. 6 miles, same route I've run in Jacksonville's summer heat and November cold, between deployments and in the compressed days before them. In the post-deployment reintegration period, when your body is still operating on a different continent's rhythms and the familiar terrain is the quickest way back to yourself. The physical discipline of it is unchanged across 13 years and multiple time zones, same pace, same breathing, same quality of attention that running creates where you are thinking and not thinking simultaneously, and both states are useful in different ways. I went for a run on Tuesday. I didn't think about Cody once. That somehow felt like progress. One evening that same week, in my quarters after the duty day had closed, I did what I do at the end of periods that require accounting. I reviewed. Not therapy, I want to be clear about the distinction. After-action methodology applied to the personal. What worked, what didn't, what had compounded unnecessarily over time through inaction. The baton handoff, executed correctly. The hangar deck, Calderon handled it, and I let him handle it, and that was the right call on my part. He had the standing and the operational history to say what he said, and I would have been crowding the correction by adding to it. The weather deck conversation, necessary, long overdue, and better than I had anticipated. The subsequent calls, productive and moving in a better direction than I'd had reason to expect. Cody's trajectory. Early indicators, positive, no promises warranted. Too soon to assess with any confidence. The desk joke. I could have stopped it years before the baton without disclosing a single classified piece of information. I could have said, at any of the 9 Thanksgiving dinners between 2017 and 2025. This is not funny to me, and I need you to stop. I had the words required no clearance review. I didn't use them. I told myself it didn't matter, and I told myself the truth would handle itself eventually, and I let 9 years pass on that logic. I could have told him the joke bothered me. I didn't need classified information for that. I just needed to say, stop. I let it run because it seemed easier. I'm not proud of that part. There is a moment in the accounting when you're being honest with yourself rather than with an audience, where you have to sit with the things you could have done differently and not make them smaller than they were. I've done this kind of accounting before. It's a professional practice as much as a personal one. But the personal version has a particular quality the professional version doesn't. The people you're accounting for are still in your life, and the ledger stays open. I could have told Cody the joke bothered me. I have already said this. I want to be precise about what I mean by it. I don't mean I should have told him my call sign or described my deployments or broken the compartmentation that kept him and everyone else in the dark about the nature of my work. I mean, I could have said, Cody, the bit where you describe me as a desk marine, I need you to stop doing that. That sentence contains no classified information. It requires no clearance. It is a normal sentence that one adult says to another when something needs to stop. I didn't say it. I made the calculation, probably unconsciously, that saying it would require explaining it, that stop making the desk joke would prompt why, and the why was something I couldn't answer without getting into territory I didn't want to get into. So I said nothing. And I said nothing the next year, and the year after that, and by Thanksgiving of 2023, I was a major, home from a classified deployment, sitting at the same table I'd sat at for a decade, eating turkey and watching my brother run the same bit he'd been running since he was 14, and I thought, this is the shape things have taken, and there's no clean way back. The clean way would have been the first year, past the rolls and also, Cody, that's not a joke I want to hear. 2 sentences. I had them. I spent 9 years not using them, and that's the part I put in the closed file now. Not with self-punishment, which is different from accountability, but with the specific acknowledgement of someone who did a thing and knows why and is not going to do it again. Accountability without theater. Own it, learn it, move. I went for a run the morning after I wrote the journal entry. 6 miles, same route. I did not think about the journal entry once during those 6 miles, which is the correct outcome of a completed after action. You close the file and you go back to work. Late one evening, I sat with a journal, sparse, functional, more log than confession, and wrote one sentence inside it. I won't reproduce it here. The journal is for the accounting, not the audience. I closed it, set the pen across the cover, and sat for a moment with the question that was written inside. I've spent 13 years making decisions with incomplete information. I keep arriving at the same question. What does a person owe the people who love them when honesty costs more than they're authorized to give? The question sat in the room without pressing for an answer. It was not uncomfortable. It was just not done yet, which is different from being unresolvable, and which I've learned is a reasonable place to be at the end of a long day. You account for what you know, you acknowledge what you don't, and tomorrow you get up and go back to work. I didn't get closure in the way that word usually gets used. What I got was something more practical. A brother who listens now, a family with a more honest shape, and a version of myself that's no longer carrying a story I never agreed to carry in the first place. The desk joke is gone. In its place is something quieter and better. On May 8th of 2026, I ran PT with my company in the early morning. Not demonstratively, not making a point about anything to anyone, just doing what a company commander does, which is show up and move and be present and let the team see that the person asking them to hold a standard holds one herself. We ran 5 miles in the pre-dawn dark along the battalion PT route, and I didn't finish first and didn't finish last, and nobody expected either outcome. After formation, Webb made the coffee joke. He's been making some variation of the same joke about the bad coffee in the company area since 2025. Some riff on the duty NCO's pot and its relationship to geological time. The implication being that whatever is being brewed in that corner has been brewing since before any of us were commissioned. He laughed at his own punchline, which is his habit and which I have come to find, in its way, genuinely endearing. He's made the same joke about the coffee since 2025. I laugh every time. Not because it's funny, it's not, but because when you've spent enough nights in the dark doing things you can't talk about in daylight, a bad coffee joke in the morning is its own kind of gift. Later that morning, I went for a run on the off-post trail. Same route, same rhythm. I thought, briefly and without residual weight, about the hangar deck. The way you think about a storm after it's passed. It happened, you were in it, it moved through. The air afterward is different from the air before. The moment on that ship when the world reorganized itself around the truth. Not because I prepared something or planned a reveal, but because I said 2 words and let 13 years of work do the rest. I didn't plan it, and I didn't need to. That's the only version worth anything. I've been a Marine officer for 13 years. I've been Fury 10 for 7. I've spent most of that time in a story I couldn't fully tell. I think I'm starting to understand that the story was always whole, I just couldn't show all of it at once. On May 9th of 2026, Cody called from the baton. The connection was clearer than the earlier calls, clear enough to hear the ambient noise of the ship behind his voice, the low mechanical undertone of a working vessel at sea. He sounded like himself. Not the performed version of himself, not the Lance Corporal running material for his squad bay, but the version underneath that. The one who used to sit on the front steps and wait for me to come home, who concentrated with his whole face over a shoelace until it held, who said, "She's a Marine officer," to a local newspaper at 10 years old, and got it exactly right. He told me he'd put in paperwork for a meritorious promotion board, working toward Corporal E4. His squad leader's recommendation, backed by Cody's own initiative in moving on it. I asked what changed. He thought about it for a moment, actually thought about it, with the pause of someone who wants to give an honest answer, rather than a quick one. Then he said, the way Calderon came to attention. He said it without fanfare, without any of the performance that used to surround everything he communicated. The way he talks when he's being honest rather than being Cody in the room. Quieter, more direct, not shaped for an audience that isn't there. I told him that was a good reason. He asked if I'd be at Christmas. I said I didn't know. Depends on the rotation cycle, the next planning period, the things I can't always predict and wouldn't forecast even if I could. He said fair. He says fair a lot more lately and says the desk is winning a lot less. Before he hung up, he said he was sorry. Not the large, comprehensive apology that tries to close an entire account in one transaction, not the kind that's as much about the speaker's relief as the listener's. Specifically, sorry for the joke. He said it once, without decoration, without waiting for acknowledgement of the saying itself. I said I heard it. That was enough. I put the phone down and sat in my quarters in the quiet of a May evening at Camp Lejeune and let it be exactly what it was. I've held a lot of quiet for a long time. Not all of it has been mine to break. But here's the thing they don't tell you about classified work, and maybe about any work that requires you to be more than you're allowed to say. The silence isn't invisible. The people who love you can feel the shape of what you're not saying, even when they can't see it. What changed on that hangar deck wasn't information. What changed was that for one moment, the shape of it was visible. And my brother finally understood the size of what had been standing right in front of him. I didn't walk away from that ship lighter because he saw me. I walked away lighter because he looked. The third call was the shortest of the three and the best. Not because it was easy, it wasn't, but because ease was never the goal. The goal was honest, and honest has its own difficulty, and Cody managed it on the third call better than he'd managed it on either of the first two. He said he'd been thinking about what I told him on the weather deck, about the gap between what I did and what I was authorized to say, and what that costs and how you carry it. He said he'd been trying to understand what 13 years of that felt like. I told him I wasn't sure understanding it from the outside was possible, exactly. Not because he wasn't smart enough, but because there are some things that can only be understood from inside them. And that's not a failure of comprehension, it's just the nature of experience. He said that made sense. He said he thought he'd spent a long time trying to understand things from outside them and calling that understanding. I said, "Welcome to 23. He laughed, the real one this time. The room-filling, whole-face laugh that I've been hearing since he was 5 years old and discovered that laughing was a way to make people look at him. But this time the direction was inward, not outward. He was laughing at something true about himself, which is a different exercise entirely from laughing to get the table to look. I thought about that laugh for the rest of the day, not with sentiment, just noting it, the way you note something that marks a change in direction. He'd always had the capacity for it. I'd seen it at 10 years old on a commissioning day, at 6 years old on a kitchen floor, in 100 small moments across 23 years of a 12-year gap, closing and opening and closing again. The capacity was always there. What changed was what he was pointing it at. I put the phone down after the call ended and sat in my quarters for a moment in the quiet of a May evening. And I thought, this is what the work looks like when it finally comes home. Not the classified work. The other kind. I had carried a version of myself that my family couldn't fully see. But on that hangar deck, the silence finally had a shape. Cody didn't need every classified detail. He just needed to understand that what stood in front of him was bigger than the joke he'd been telling. I walked away from that moment knowing one thing. Sometimes people don't need a long explanation. They just need to finally see the truth. If you've ever been underestimated, stayed silent too long, or had to prove your worth without saying a word, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. Did you forgive them, walk away, or let your actions speak for you? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to remember their worth.